everybody. I am Bilgehan Alagöz. I am the Director of Foreign Policy Program at Center for Iran Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the online panel on Syrian crisis and Iran's role. A decade ago, people of Syria started to demand more democracy and freedom, but within 10 years, we have witnessed loss of many lives, a huge immigration problem, increasing influence of external actors. And today, with three distinguished speakers, we are going to discuss to what extent Iran has played a role. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you the speakers. Mr. Bassam Barbandi worked as a diplomat for 14 years, including the Embassy of Syria in Washington and the Syrian government mission to the United Nations in New York City. He left his job at the Syrian Embassy in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2013 and co-founded People Demand Change. Currently, he works with the Council for Global Problem Solving and the New Line Institute. Professor Mehdi Nurbash works now as a professor of international affairs and business at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology in Pennsylvania. He previously worked at Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Dr. Nurbash published many books and a lot of articles about the Middle East, Iran, and Iran policy in the Syrian crisis. And the third speaker is going to be Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi. He's an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He was an assistant professor of regional studies at Shahid Beheshti University and a guest lecturer at the Department of Regional Studies at the University of Tehran. Dr. Azizi wrote many articles about the Syrian crisis and Iran. And before starting our discussion, I'd like to ask all the three speakers to limit their speech with 10 and 15 minutes because we will have a fruitful Q&A session at the end of the speech. And I would like to start with Mr. Bassam Barbandi. I actually wonder the reasons why you left your job in the middle of the Syrian crisis. I mean, what urged you to leave the position? And as an eyewitness to the crisis, how would you describe the last 10 years for Syria?
Yeah, thank you for having me with this distinguished guest. Your question has two parts, one part of me, one part of the Syrian revolution. The first part of me, I left in 2013, but I officially from the embassy, but I used to work to support the revolution while I was at the embassy. I was from 2011. I tried to raising awareness with the officials as much as I can, with think tanks, with the journalists about where US policy should be towards Syria, how to support the Syrian, using my capacity as a diplomat. And then when I find out that it's too much to be with that regime, with that scale of killing, non-stop killing, that was the time to say enough is enough. So I left. On the other side of the story, or how I see it from 10 years from now, it's really very painful memories. I don't have any good memories, zero memories. Our life on personal level has been affected big time. Me, my family, on personal level. I mean, I don't think I know any Syrian family, they have any happy memories in the last 10 years. Everybody has bad memories, sad memories. We always have a hope for tomorrow, but on reality, on science level, if we want to see the things from the science level, not from the arts, from math, how things is going on, I don't see this tragedy is ending anytime soon. If you want, I mean, this is my answers to your questions.
Mm-hmm. So we are now here to analyze most of Iran's role in Syria. Iran and Syria has a deep relationship. It's not a new relationship.
No, it's very old.
Yeah. So from our point of view, to what extent Iran has had a role in Syria?
Yeah, here I will back a little bit about the history, recent history. When Hafiz Assad came to the power in 1970 or 1971, he's an Alawite. in Syrian constitution, it was written that the Alawite, the president should be a Muslim. And he had legitimate problem because most of the Syrian ulama or sheikh or scholars, religious scholars, they considered the Alawite as non-Muslim at that time. And he needs someone to give him that legitimacy. Actually, Assad take over the power in 1970, and he became president in 1971. The reason why they have this period of time is to find solution about being Alawite and Sunni. At that time, the Lebanese scholars, Muqtada الصدر, not Muqtada الصدر, but الصدر in Lebanon, he gave him the fatwa to say the Alawite are part of the Shia. And then that means Alawite become Muslims and he become a president. Since that time, I think in the Middle East or in the Levant area, we start to have the coalition of minorities to rule the majorities. And I talk about minorities here, specifically the Shia. As price, Assad paid back to Al-Sadr, Imam Al-Sadr, he helped him in Lebanon to create what we call Harakat Amal movement. And he paid back for the Shia in Lebanon because at that time, Lebanon was mainly dominated by Christian and Sunni, and the Shia were not related to any political parties or social parties even. They have 2 or 3 people who are old families, but they belong more to bourgeois rather than to the grassroots of the Shi'ism. And little by little, the Shi'ism started, or Shia and Harakat Amal, it started to be a power, strong power within Lebanese society by supporting of Syria. That is in the 70s. In the 80s, there was a big war between Assad and Palestinian forces in Lebanon, Yasser Arafat and PLO. One of the reasons, there's so many reasons because of that war. One of the reasons, because it's sectarian. PLO is mainly Sunni. They are not under control of Assad or even Amal movement. So they destroy PLO. For again, this is one of the reasons out of so many reasons. And at that time, to fill the gap, who will be on the south of Lebanon facing Israel, Syria, and Iran, they created Hezbollah. So Iran injected in that big way of the policy dynamics of the Middle East. At the same time, when Iran had a war with Iraq, 8 years bloody war, Assad, he sided with Iran against Iraq, against all the Arabism, Sunnism, you name it, all the slogans of Arabism and Ba'ath Party. It's supposed in theory that Assad be with Iran, with Iraq against Iran. But the big story is, again, it's minorities coalition, the Shia Alawite against the Sunni. This is how they see the region, the dynamics. At the same time, here where Iranian influence start to enter Syria. So all the business during the war, 8 years war between Iraq and Iran, the Iranian start to create center of powers inside Syria, but at that time was very much limited to economic center of powers, very much business rather than military or intelligence, the way interfered the system. And at that time, they built the first shrine in Syria, sponsored by Iranian, Sit Ruqayya, and they built it in the heart of Damascus, the Sunni near Umayyad Mosque. It's 50 meters. They built the largest shrine in Damascus. It's Sayyida Ruqayya. And that started to reflect the relation between Iran and Syria and how deep is it. Yet during Hafiz Assad, there was a limit how much Iran can interfere in Syria, how much Iran can interfere in Lebanon. So Assad considered Hafiz that Lebanon is part of Syria, not part of Iran. And whenever there is a conflict, Assad was always make sure this is our territory. When Hafiz died, Bashar came, that relation has reversed. The relation between Syria and Iran, it becomes strategic. Iran, for example, built for Syria the nuclear reactor in Deir ez-Zor. They sponsored it financially. Things that Assad, the father, will never do. Iranian influence in Damascus is become seen. Syrians start to serve officers to Iran for a military academy in Iran. This Assad father will never do. So Iran start to have economic influence and political influence and religious influence. Bashar allowed Iranian to open more shrines in Syria, in Raqqa, in Deir Zor, in Dar'a, in Tartus, in larger scales. So Iranians start to go deep inside society before the revolution, with the blessing of Assad. When the revolution started at that time, 2011, so the first in May 2011, just to see how the regional countries they start to react to the Syrian crisis. So Turkey, Emirates, and Qatar, 3 delegations came to Assad at that time with some proposal to solve that problem or the crisis or the revolution in peaceful way, in legal way, in constitutional way, change the constitution, make more parties, more media, more elections. So give something for the people to listen, and you will be a hero. That's the three common things among the 3 proposals from Emirati, Qatari, and Turkish sides. Each one give them concrete proposal with financial support, with political support. But Assad listened to the Iranian. So at the same time, when these 3 countries, the regional came, Iranian came with different message. And at that time, I think Kharazi or Ali Akbar Wilayati, he came to Syria, and he was telling the Syrian leaders that, look, guys, we passed the Green Movement in Iran in 2009. And we were having the same choice you're having right now. So either you listen to the people, the way Egypt did, Libya, Yemen, and then you see where you are heading to, or you will do our own experience in a Green Movement. Just send your forces to the street, the police people. We will send our expertise. We will do this. We will help you that. And that model was very much matching Assad's way of thinking. So I cannot say Iranian push him the way he doesn't want to go, rather than Iranian give him what he wants to hear. And here we have completely different kind of relation between Iran and Syria. So this is the first time Iranian forces, as an expertise, they came to Syria, they became on Syrian ground. According to one friend of mine, he was Iranian diplomat at the UN at that time. He was telling me in 2014 or 2015, and it's according to him, I cannot verify it, but I think it's make logical, that when that started 2011, the Iranians were really worried that any stabilization in Syria for short term would affect Hezbollah in Lebanon. So for them, they sent their forces, even it's under supporting the Assad regime forces, but mainly to make sure that the route from Damascus airport to Hezbollah is safe and secure. So the area where they stationed is on the route between the airport and Lebanese border to keep the supply of weapons, hoping that in the meantime that Assad will take care of the people and things will back to normal. So that was the first step. At the same time, matching that time, we had the nuclear deal between the United States and Iran. And the Iranian, they want to keep the weapons of Hezbollah on the table just as way of blackmailing the West, that we can threat Israeli security from South Lebanon in order to empower or strengthen their cards in face of American when they deal with the nuclear things. Mm-hmm. So at the same time, it comes with the Syrian revolution. So they have that very much interest. With the time passing, they find out that Assad regime is much weaker than they thought. Mm-hmm. And they could collapse. But for Iran, they found out that this is...
There was a great miscalculation from most of the actors in the region, also in the global level.
Big time. Mm-hmm. But here where we Iran, so Iranian, they, since Khomeini, the 1979, they have the slogans of exporting the revolution. They need the land, they need the empire of Iranian, Persian, not Iranian, Persian empire again. So I think they squeezed that moment in Syria where the regime is weak. They are not weaker than the people think. They are not in control. They send more forces to fight the revolution. So they become part of the Assad forces. whenever there's a shortage of manpower, they get from Iraq, from Hezbollah. Syria doesn't have a Shia, so they don't have a local people to work with them the way they had it, or they have it in Hezbollah or in Yemen or even in Iraq. So they have to get outside forces. It's majorly IRGC, then Fatimiyun, Zainabiyun from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon. So the point that today, where's Iran? So I think today's Iran is reached where it's want to be, that they are in control of Syria, in a way, part of Syria, big time, the way they are controlling Lebanon, the way they control Iraq, in different shape, but the same results. Any solution for Syria politically, they have to.
In the Q&A session, maybe the solution, the future. I can here continue with Professor Nurbash.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So just as this is the background, very quick history, how Iranian looking into the whole region.
We all have to remember the background, because now it has been more than 10 years, and we sometimes forget the past and try to find a solution through the forgotten past. So it's very important. Thank you. And Professor Nurbash, maybe we can go from this point. Mr. Barbandi also mentioned the first attitude of Iran towards Syria. As far as I remember, when the Arab uprisings first emerged in Tunis, in Libya, in Egypt, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei welcomed these uprisings, because he named them as Islamic awakening, and according to the Supreme Leader, it was all these people got inspired from the Islamic Revolution. But when it came to Syria, we witnessed a great change in Iran's rhetoric, and as Mr. Barbandi has mentioned, it is kind of a deepening strategy between Iran and Syria. From your point of view, to what extent Syria is vital for Iran's foreign policy, Iran's strategy in the Middle East?
By the way, I was very much enjoying what Bassam was talking about, and you disrupted, Bassam. I'm just joking. No, but that was really a good discussion. Let me take you back a little bit in the discussion that you wanted me to open it up. In 2011, when the Arab Spring started, Ayatollah Khamenei came out and said, this is Islamic awakening in all over the 4 countries, Tunisia, Syria, Iraq, and of course, other places that, Egypt. Islamic awakening, and he was not, right on that, to labeling the Arab Spring as an Islamic awakening, because the Arab Spring was mostly about corrupted regimes, mostly about dictatorial regimes. And the Arab Spring was very much fed up with authoritarianism. And that was overall, what it was. And it was very much the Arab Spring for the freedom, for democratization of the societies. And that was overall, what. Then when it came to Syria, Ayatollah Khamenei said, Syria is very different from the other, 3 Arab Spring. And that was another, of course, miscalculation in that area. Overall, the first reasoning for the 3 countries that from the beginning are in Syria, they are Turkey, they are Qatar, and they are Iran. Turkey and Qatar, of course, is very obvious. As you know, mostly in Syria, the organized opposition to Assad regime esteemed from, of course, Muslim Brotherhood, and in the past, for example, when the father of Bashar Assad very much occasionally wanted to suppress the opposition, it was going to Muslim Brotherhood. That was overall, what it was. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria was a very natural ally of Iran, because the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria was very much from the beginning, and I hope, Bassam clarifies, this for me, was very much anti-Saudi. And you know that the Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, if you go, for example, to the case of, Egypt, and why, for example, Saudi Arabia finally took the side of Tamarrud movement to topple Morsi in that country, because Saudi Arabia was not tolerating the Muslim Brotherhoods in any other country. And as you know, in part of the Arab world, the Saudi Arabia, that is a terrorist organization. Let's call it that way. Iran went to Syria. Of course, Turkey and Qatar went to Syria to support the Muslim Brothers. And Muslim Brothers and the Syrian, of course, people for many, many years, as Bassam said it, the father of course, the father of Bashar, Hafiz al-Assad, came to power through a military coup. It was not election. It was not any of those things. And then Bashar, comes to power, and Iran is very much in Syria, and that is a debate, and that is a discussion from the beginning. That is the first concept that the Iranian government, of course, threw in that, debate, that Iran is in Syria for deepening the depth of the strategy against Israel. That was overall, تعمیق عمق استراتژی ضد اسرائیلی ایران. That was the purpose. And they were in Iraq. They wanted, of course, to take over, or at least to safeguard Syria in connection, of course, to Lebanon, to make overall, that they call it the Hilal Shi'i, that, that belt. That was overall, the purpose. 9 months after the I don't know, and I hope, if any of you guys, have any more accurate information on this, especially Bassam. I know, you're close to the event in Syria. I do not know the exact date of the Iranian military intervention, but I can say from whatever, evidence I could, find, that the first few months, the Iranian, of course, intervened militarily on the side of Assad, because Assad told Iran that Assad is not capable to suppress overall the opposition inside. And Bassam is absolutely right that from Iran, Hamadani, the General Hamadani, who was a Sipahi, and he put together that model of suppressing the Green movement in Iran, was sent to Syria to copy that model of suppression. And overall, that model of suppression is to get people who were not religious, people who were not, nothing in any shape or, manner, to just buy them, to pay them, to rent, of course, their services in order to suppress overall, other people. That was what, they done in Iran. In Iran, Hamadani was very much, of course, had pride in this, that in Persian, they call it latha, or the charlatans, or those, to hire them and to organize them in order to suppress, of course, the Green movement in Iran. And the same model came to Syria. And of course, Sepah was over there to create also another component of the Sepah that was, Basij. Basij overall in Iran is an offshoot of the Sepah in Iran. And those are the guys that go to the street. And they do not put a, of course, military uniform. Bassam knows in Iran, they call them lebas shakhsiha. And these are the people who go for suppressing the opposition or go to the street. And of course, they have guns, they have, other thing that, think. They brought that model to Syria in order, of course, to help. And from early on, what I know, and I have the evidence, 9 months after the civil war in Syria, and I hesitate to say it, civil war, but I don't have any other war, because that is not a civil war. That was a revolution from the beginning, and civil war was something that Assad created later on. Civil war is usually one group of people in a country against another group of people. But in Syria, that was not a civil war in that sense. But let's just call it, internal war in that sense, because I don't want to use the word, civil war. 9 months after that internal war, and as all of you know, Assad is started from the beginning, the violence against opposition. Opposition inside Syria, for the first 4 months, it was peaceful. That is documented everywhere. And they were not resorting to any kind of violence. And Assad did. And Assad did through, of course, the support of Iran and some other the government. And on the other side, I have to tell you this also, that the Turkish border also was opened to the jihadis from other part of Central Asia, Chechens and others. The Qatari government also, after 4 months, began to arm the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, to protect themselves. These are the 3 countries that from the beginning, of course, they are over there. 9 months after that internal war, the Iranian government sees that it is really reaching a deadlock in that sense. They are coming back and are proposing to the opposition that come and participate in the Assad government. But there are 2 conditions. Assad stays on power, and number 2, all of the security forces, military and everything else, stays under the control of Assad. And if you are the opposition, if you are the Muslim Brotherhood, and you think that you don't have any leverage in that sense, naturally you don't agree with that kind of course, invitation, and they did not agree with it. That continued, and I go through, of course, other discussions. Then the Iranian, as Bassam said it, then they hired from Pakistan. They hired overall Haydariyun from Iraq, Zainabiyun from of course, from Afghanistan, and another part of the world, and very much inside of Iran. Iranian government had a lot of problem to instigate a lot of younger generation to go and participate in that war. And one of the reasons they relied on the foreign forces, because they could not encourage the Iranians, who are very much aware or were aware what is going on, of course, in Syria. Iranian government had to resort and hire the Afghanis and others. And I go through the Afghanistan case later on, and what the Iranian government did to the Afghanis in order to instigate them to participate in that war. Then later on, of course, the depth of deepening the depth was, of course, changed to the slogan of protecting the Zainab, of course, Maqbare, the Zainab, you know that, And later on at the end, when, of course, the Iranian government was very much losing the ground over there after 2015, that they invited, and the Iranian government supported Putin and Russia, of course, to come. And 2015 was a dead end. Neither the opposition nor, of course, Assad could suppress anything or move, of course, anything. And the Iranian, of course, did not have the air power. And the reason they supported Putin to come to Syria, and they promised, of course, Putin that we do not need your ground forces. We want you to come, of course, to Syria and use your air forces. And as you know, from 2015, the map of Syria to some extent was changed. And what Russians did in Syria, the Iranians used the model for the suppression of the Green Movement in Iran. And the Russians used the Chechen war model and brought it to Syria. And indiscriminately, they bombed various areas to submission. That was overall, what it was. But let me conclude my, discussion, and we'll leave it, of course, for the discussion later on. What took place during these years that the Iranians were not aware of it, Putin is getting close, very close to Israel. Putin is getting close to the other Arab, countries. Inside Syria, the Israelis repeatedly announced that as long as Iranians are inside Syria, we do not allow Syria to stabilize. Then Putin collaborates and gives information to the Israeli army. And Israeli army is bombing mostly Iranian, but sometimes also some Syrian forces too. And the Syrian forces is not overall to punish Syria, but to warn them that as long as this is the situation, then we go ahead and very much, of course, we do not allow to the government to stabilize. You know that, at the moment, the Putin, of course, Russia is training the Syrian military. For the reconstruction, I come back, of course, to that discussion that is entangled to the United States policy, the Arab world overall policy. But this is where we are at the moment. That Iranians had a huge chance through Qatar, that was close to Iran, and Turkey, that they could talk to each other to bring peace to Syria, but they did not. They preferred overall, to support a type of authoritarian regime in that country. And we ended up with over 600,000 deaths, close to about 11 million, of course, refugees, 6 million of them in Syria, 5 million, of course, outside. And something else, just one sentence, the rise of the political right in Europe is as a result of the immigrant, mostly from Syria. I'm done. I'm sorry. I talked to you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Now you also have mentioned the role of Russia, and at this point I have a question for Dr. Azizi. I follow your work very closely. You have recently written a piece about the recent initiative, including Russia, Qatar, and Turkey, and you try to find the reasons why Iran was absent in this initiative. And at this point, can you explain us how, from point of Iran, how Astana process is perceived and this recent initiative is perceived? Can we now mention Iran and Russia are now rivals rather than partners in Syria?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank İRAM Center for organizing this interesting event. If you let me, I would put the answer to your question in a kind of broader context in order to make more sense of it. I would like to, of course, much of what I wanted to say is already mentioned by the two distinguished speakers, but I present my views on Iran's role in the Syrian crisis in two parts. In the first part, I briefly discussed the evolution of Iran's approach toward the Syrian crisis over the past 10 years, because I think it's important to understand the current trajectories, and especially the interactions between different actors, as you just mentioned, for example, within the Astana framework, but also beyond that framework. And in the second part, I will discuss the most important factors, again, including the relations between Iran, Turkey, and Russia, the most important factors that could affect Iran's role in Syria's future. So there's going to be a brief look to the past and then a look to the future. Iran's approach toward the Syrian crisis, I would argue that it has gone through three different phases. In the first period, in the first phase, which started with the outbreak of the Syrian crisis and lasted until 2017, security and military considerations played the most important role in Iran-Syria strategy. As mentioned by other speakers, Iran was mostly concerned that the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government would provide regional rivals, especially Turkey and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, with the opportunity to expand their influence. Of course, there was in terms of their view, Iran was closer maybe to Turkey and Qatar, but at that time, Iran saw a kind of unified regional front facing it, and it was reflected in Syria from the Iranian point of view. So that was how it started. And then when the Syrian uprising turned into a civil war, Iran decided to intervene directly, as mentioned, with the, directly by dispatching the Quds force and also by organizing, local groups. Then another turning point was the rise of terrorist groups, especially the ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which kind of contributed, to the expansion of Iran's military role in Syria. Iran was determined to fight the terrorists in Syria and Iraq to prevent the expansion of territories under their control, toward its own borders. That is what was referred to by Dr. Nurbakhsh as strategic depth. So it was kind of, within the framework of preserving that strategic depth, preserving that kind of access to Syria and Lebanon. In December 2016, the Syrian army and its allies, Iran and Russia, of course, succeeded in recapturing Aleppo and from the rebel groups, of course. The development actually kind of alleviated Iran's concerns over a possible fall of the Assad government. Then we had the formation of the Astana peace process in 2017, which kind of provided Iran with the opportunity to play a political and diplomatic role in Syria, alongside Russia and Turkey. Then the fall of the ISIS Caliphate in 2017, was another factor that paved the way for Iran to, redefine its role and to develop its role actually beyond the military sphere in Syria. And also Iran supported, for example, the Russian initiatives like the Syrian National Congress in Sochi, etc. So it could be said that that was the beginning of the second phase in 2017, in which political and economic priorities started to come to the top of Iran's agenda. So that there was a kind of shift. Of course, Iran was still active militarily on the ground, but it started to define also political and economic priorities for itself and to develop plans how to achieve them. The second phase was ended, I would argue, at the beginning of last year, beginning of 2020, with the assassination of General Bassam Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force in Iraq by the United States. Following that incident, Iran felt its strategic depth, of course, in danger, its deterrence, at risk, a kind of, like unexpected risk. And then Iran started to kind of develop a counter strategy and announced the expulsion of US troops from the Middle East as its main, main regional goal, not only in Syria, but in the region in general. However, so that was actually started at the start of a, refocus from the Iranian side to the military and security considerations. But, the corona pandemic resulted in a halt of major military conflicts in Syria in general. And also, and the pandemic also contributed to the economic crisis in Iran. So it limited actually Iran's resources to finance large scale military adventures in Syria. So that was one of the reasons that we didn't see a kind of, huge shift. There was a shift of approach, there was a shift of attitude, again, from political and military considerations to the, political and economic considerations to the military priorities. But these factors kind of, stopped Iran from going further so far. That was so kind of overview of change of Iran's approach. So where we are currently is, I think, and where Iran is heading now within the framework of the Syrian crisis, I think depends on four important factors. And there are four factors or four major trends that can, affect Iran's role in Syria or in Syria's future. The first factor is the evolving role of the United States in Syria, after Biden's inauguration. The second factor is the fate of Iran-US diplomatic interaction. The third factor is the normalization of relations between the Arab states of the Persian Gulf and Syria. And the fourth one is bilateral interactions between Russia and Turkey outside the Astana format. So actually, number 3 and 4 of these factors, which I'm going to briefly discuss, are going to be kind of answer to your main question. So regarding the first factor, as we see, 2 months since the start of Biden's presidency, the new U.S. administration has not yet elaborated its Syria strategy. However, current trends and what we can see on the ground show that the main pillars of the new U.S. strategy are going to be, to continue and to even expand military presence in Syria. Then to maintain political and economic pressure on Assad governments. So we cannot see, for example, any sign of easing sanctions on Assad. And then to continue trying to contain Iran in Syria and at the same time preventing the revival of the ISIS. I mean, Iran and the ISIS are increasingly referred to by the American officials as 2 main threats for the US role in Syria. So these 2 actors are going to be also at the forefront of US focus in Syria. Then there are other factors, of course, for example, reassuring the Syrian courts and resuming political cooperation with allies in multilateral frameworks regarding the Syrian crisis. Besides, and this is a very important factor, besides, there are some voices in the new US administration who suggest that Washington should work with Moscow and of course with Ankara to secure its fundamental interests in Syria, including that main objective of limiting Iran's role in the country. So adopting such a strategy by Washington could have implications for Iran, of course. If US appears serious about engaging with Russia, and especially if the US strategy leads to the revival of, UN-initiated frameworks such as the Geneva process, Moscow may see an interest in entering into, a new diplomatic track with Washington, which could be in parallel with or even as an alternative to the Astana process. So this is going to be the main threat maybe to the Astana format. The Russians are also aware that stability and political transition and also economic reconstruction in Syria cannot be achieved in the absence of a meaningful Western participation. This view, of course, is not compatible with Iran's approach because Iran sees the Astana format as the only working framework for solving the Syrian crisis. There's a reason for this, of course, because Iran was effectively excluded from other frameworks by the Western countries especially. But anyway, this focus, Washington's focus on containing Iran could also increase actually the risk of a military confrontation between US and Iran or US and the Iran-backed groups. I will go into the details further if there's a need to. But then, just very quickly to mention the other factors, there's also, the success of the second factor is the fate of a diplomatic process between Iran and the United States. Because if the 2 sides fail to restore the deal, the tensions between the 2 countries are likely to, increase, and this would involve Syria as well. We've seen the intensification of attacks on US positions by Iran-backed groups, not only in Iraq, but also in Syria. The latest one was in March 23, for example. The US position in eastern Syria was attacked by some unknown group, which is believed to be one of the Iran-backed groups. But on the other hand, if this diplomatic process achieves a kind of success, and if Iran agrees to expand the scope of diplomatic interactions with the United States, it could have just reverse, the opposite implications for Syria. At the current situation, based on Iran's principled position, it's not going to accept a kind of comprehensive deal, as it's said, but reducing tensions between Iran and the United States, if it is accompanied by, for example, Washington agreeing to involve Iran in relevant diplomatic processes, that could contribute to a change in Iran's position toward a kind of more constructive role, maybe. Just in 2 minutes, if I have time, I will.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to continue with Mr. Barbandi.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And then the third factor is related to the potential role of the region's Arab states in Syria's economic reconstruction. As you mentioned, there's been this, new framework with between Qatar, Turkey, and Russia, this new trilateral format. It was, of course, a Russian initiative. On the other hand, Russia has been trying to encourage the UAE to take part in Syria's reconstruction, and also to normalize relations with Iran, with the Syrian government. So Iran is in a kind of contradictory situation because, on the one hand, Iran has stressed that the need not to condition, international participation in Syria's economic reconstruction with the start of the political transition. And there's a reason for this, because Iran wants to help restore the Assad government's international legitimacy. On the other hand, Iran's own financial, crisis because of the sanctions, etc., it doesn't allow Iran itself to play a kind of active role in Syria's post-war reconstruction. So there's a dilemma, there's a contradiction here which Iran faces. I believe the fourth factor may be the situation in Idlib, which is related to Russia and Turkey, to the Q&A session. So I stop here, and sorry for taking much time.
Thank you. And Mr. Barbandi, I'd like to continue with a question to you. It's my question, not from the audience. As an experienced diplomat, I really wonder what do you think about Russia's increasing role in Syria? While speaking about Iran's role, we need to emphasize the role of Russia. And recently, it's not officially accepted, but we hear that there's an ongoing secret diplomacy between Israel and Assad regime under Russia's moderation. What do you think about this all Russian effort? Is it kind of umbrella in Syria, or is it a new phase in the Syrian crisis?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I will try to answer this, and I will some comments of Mr. Mahdi and Mr. Azizi comments within your answer.
Sure.
The things how we see it from Syria as a Syrian now. Number one, it's clear from Mr. Mahdi and Mr. Azizi that the Syrian conflict is not anymore about Syria itself. So it was, the four pillars that Mr. Azizi mentioned about Iran's role in Syria, I don't agree with it, but I agree with the concept that the solution of Syria, it has nothing to do with the Syrian anymore, not even with the Assad regime or not with the opposition. It's about Iran, Turkey, Russia, United States, and Israel, how they will find common grounds among each others. I will talk with Mr. Mahdi to say the major mistake the Syrian revolution had were two. Number one, it's moved the revolution from being democratic revolution, civil societies revolution into Islamist. I think that was one of the killing mistake for the Syrian, where we are right here, right now, is because the shifting from civil society demands transparency, democracy, human rights, this kind of norms that we were asking for, we were shifted, or they were shifted or pushed to be more Islamist. And that was a major mistake. And we are paying price of it. The second major mistake is that it's become more military revolution. It's not anymore civilian. So combining the military and the Islamists, it shaped the revolution in a very negative way. Even Syrians themselves, they don't support it the way they used to support it in the first year, let's say. This number one. Number two, again, Mr. Azizi, I'm talking from Syrian perspective, from Syrian on the ground. We hoped when the revolution started, Iran as a government, they have in a way high respected in Syria, especially after the war in 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah has highly rated in the whole Arab world, not only in Syria. Iran, it was highly respected after 2016, 2006 war. Russia, it was neutral, but we don't have anything to do with it as a feeling toward the people. So when the revolution started, we hoped as a Syrian that Iran will use its influence on Assad to not to go violence. At that time, nobody was asking Assad to step aside. The people were asking to reforms, political reforms, economic reforms. What we saw exactly on the ground, the opposite, that Iranian forces were on the ground, they were killing the people, going to the Sunni mosque and destroy it, making fun of the Sahaba. So they start to do sectarian act on Syria in the way that we were not expected, number one, and there's no need for it, number two. So the behaviors of Iranian and the regime push the people to be Islamist and then to be militarized. Plus, the other regional country, they want this to happen. So it matched the interests of the regional powers to have another place to fight, and was Syria. Number three, Iranian till today, they didn't give Assad money. They didn't give him grants. They give him soft loans with sovereignty guarantees, same like Russian. When we go about how much Russia and Iran spending on Syria, they are billions of dollars every year, but this goes for their own military operation and their own government activities on the ground. But this doesn't go to the Syrian government or support the Syrian people. So today, Syria, whenever they need the money, they go to Iran, they get a credit line from Iran. They have $2 billion or $6 billion credit line. Sovereignty, that the Iranian and the Russian, they always ask Assad that we need sovereignty guarantees. Why to give you this loans? How you will pay back? And here where Assad, they give them the Syrian natural resources. And here we back to your question. Today, where they reach to the point that Syria doesn't have any more natural resources or building or wealth to give it to Iran or Russia for getting loans. That means the regime shortly will not have any money to pay for basic services. And we know that the economic crisis in Syria is very bad, and the economy in Iran is very bad, and Russia is very bad. And recently, the Iranian officials were talking to the Russian officials to say, Habibi, we don't have money anymore for Assad. Please, you take care of him financially. So today, everybody tried to claim the victory, Assad regime, Iran and Russia, but the victory means that you have to provide service as post-war, and nobody have the money. And here where they stuck. So that's why the Russian, they went to Saudi Arabia, they went to Emirates, then they went to Qatar, just to say, guys, we need the money. We need any kind of support the regime to survive. I don't agree that Astana process is the place to solving Syrian crisis. I think Astana, it was built to organize the differences among the three countries. Iran doesn't trust Russia. Russia doesn't trust Turkey. Turkey doesn't trust Iran. Three countries on the ground, they don't trust each other for historical reason. Look about the history, it says. So I think the Astana is a kind of a process of coordination between the three countries, economically, militarily. If there's any clashes, the Astana process or the expertise in this, they said to solve the problems. I don't think there will be any acceptance for Iran to stay in Syria, regardless, but nevertheless, Iran doesn't care if anybody wants it to stay or not. We watch Iran model in Iraq, we watch Iran model in Yemen, in Lebanon. The Iranian try always to build decentralized government. The government in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen is very weak. There's so many militia on the ground. The militia have its own parties, and these parties have more influence on the parliament than the government and the president. This is the model. Whereas the Russian model of the government is like Belarusia, where you have central government, strong army, control everything. So at a certain time, the Iranian project at the end game with the Russian project as end game, they are not the same projects. Plus, Iran is under pressure from Israel, from the Arab world, from, I hope, from the United States as well, to do something in Syria. But I believe within this administration, that they will deal with Iran if they will reach, if we as a Syrian, if we will be lucky enough to this administration to set some kind of formula to solve Syrian problems, Syrian crisis. They will try to satisfy all the needs of all the players, including Iran.
You mean the U.S. administration, new U.S. administration?
I think if we are lucky as a Syrian and they will think about how to solve Syria problem, I think at certain time they will say, Iran, what do you want in Syria? Turkey, what do you want in Syria?
The concrete policy from the U.S. administration is still arming YPG when it comes to Syria policy.
Yeah, I know, but that's why they will come to Turkey to say, Turkey, what's your interest in Syria? What's your top priority that you want to protect in Syria? It will be PKK, YPG, there's no question. And they will go to Russia, they say, we need a Hmeimi base. The big question for me is Iran, what Iran wants from Syria. Do they want to stay? And if they stay, what the shape of staying, I don't know. They cannot stay because they don't have the social safety network. There's no Shia in Syria to say, we believe in Wilayat al-Faqih. That's why they are bringing Afghani, Pakistani, they give them nationality, they give them properties, but all this is fake because the minute the war will stop, Syria will come back, they will find foreigners in our lands. They will kick them out in a way or others. This is not sustainable things. So that will be a big question, what Iran wants in Syria. Is it they just want to put more pressure on Israel to have nuclear things? I doubt it. This is that simple. It's much more complicated. We believe it's empire. It's the feeling, the same feeling of having the Persian Empire that reached to the Mediterranean. They are already in Gaza, already in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Lebanon, and Damascus. So why not continue on that? And especially there is no really pushback, serious pushback from anyone. Look in Yemen, they try to accommodate the Houthis rather than to say you are doing something wrong. So last point, that the Russians, for example, they were in Syria, they try to make kind of superficial reconciliation between the people who displaced and the regime. Whenever Iranians go to any area in Syria, they make sure to kick out everybody. They have a problem of demographic problem. It was created purposely to kick the Sunni out. I hate to talk Sunni Shia, but this is the reality. They want to take, out of 10 million Syrian IDPs, refugees, I think 99% are Sunni.
From the audience, we have a relevant question, and then I'm going to continue with Professor Nurbash. Aisha Aydın asked, it is said that Iran placed the Shiites in the places vacated by the local population. In this situation, will there be a power conflict between Russia and Syria?
This is what I'm saying. The Iranian model always is create its own militia, create its own people. So whenever there's stability, they have the power to go, power sharing in the parliament, power sharing in the government, and they say, we need our people to be protected. Since there is no Sunni, there is not Shia, they are getting their own people. They get them from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. They give them the Syrian ID, Syrian nationalities. And now 10 years, they become Syrian. You see the point. So Iran is looking for 10 years from now. It's not looking today what they are doing. That's why I'm saying that Iranian, whenever they go, they never make any reconciliation with the local IDPs. They kick them out. We say we don't need anyone to come back. Mm-hmm. That's why half the population left and they cannot come back. So there's so many areas, so many houses empty, and they are being filled by this kind of categories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Professor Nurbash, Mr. Mohammed Abdulmejid has a question for you. Mm-hmm. Here is the question. Many Iranians say that Iran has spent huge money in Syria and that it should take this money back. Do you think that Iran has the right to recover this money, or is Iran of Syria?
No, I really do not think the Iranian government has any right, or the Iranian people, to ask the Syrian, to pay them back. The estimate is this. Iran has spent during that 10 years close to about $30 billion. This is a rough estimate, but informed estimate inside Syria. And that is not, what Bassam was, talking about. Whatever loan, they gave to the Assad regime, that is overall, something else. But overall, the expenses, I'm talking about the expenses. No, they don't have any right. And the latest justification for the Iranian government, why they were in Syria, and the regime apologists, they argue that they were invited by a legal government. And there is a lot of debate and discussion about the legality of that government. The governments overall in the international relation, they are legal as long as the consent of the people is very much for them to rule. When there is, of course, discord between the people and, of course, their government, you have to go back and see what is a debate, what is a discussion, what is a legality, of course, that government. And this is overall, what we see in the international relation. I want to go back to a couple of, small, points. I think it clarifies. In the, of course, talk of Dr. Azizi, I totally agree with him that there was a diplomatic phase in the Iranian very much behavior or attitude after a while. But I want to say that it was not because the Iranian wanted to pursue a diplomatic way. They did not have any other choice, because Syrian, as Bassam said, have a little more conciliatory tones toward the Syrian people, a little bit more than the Iranians. Iranians were very much, of course, for the, I call it, I want to call it this way, ethnic cleansing inside overall, Syria. They didn't want, and I talked a couple of days ago with our friend Abdulaziz about, Iranian buying properties inside overall, Syria. And these are, of course, from the people who left, or, the government, of course, nationalize, of course, their property, selling it to this and, that. What I'm saying is this, that the Iranian government did not have any other choice. As during the war and during the years, the Russian got the upper hand in Syria, and the Turkey also, got the upper hand. These are the two very important players inside, Syria, and Iran compared to them is not really that important. Recently, and a stat, came out that in terms of the economic activities inside Syria, Iran is placed in the 9th category. The first two categories goes to goes to Russia and, of course, Turkey. And that shows how much of the influence the Iranian, of course, lost in Syria during the years. Then overall, my point for that, for Bassam, I totally agree with you, Bassam, my friend, that yes, the revolution inside Syria became radicalized. But we have to remember this. 1 year after the internal war in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra went into Syria, not from the beginning. 2 years after the internal war in Syria, Daesh, for the first time, entered into Syrian conflict by the invitation of Jabhat al-Nusra, and as you know, later on, they had a conflict, within themselves too. Then when they went into Syria, they radicalized the whole environment. How they radicalize it? Daesh is going and, for example, capturing this small town or so and so. In order to give them protection, what do they have to do? What the citizens of that small state, they have to do for Daesh? To become a member, to work with them, and little by little, after a while, the revolution in Syria became radicalized, because Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, look at Ahrar al-Sham. Ahrar al-Sham later on was established as a reaction to that kind of course, Islamization and radicalization. They wanted to compete with Daesh. And the whole revolution, I don't want to say unknowingly, but unintentionally, was radicalized, because radical groups were very much, of course, working in that country. The last point that I wanted to mention here, and that was Bassam raised, that the United States and others, of course, go to, for example, to all of the partners and tell them, what do you want? I think Iran does not have really that much influence, but some in that area. Now, there are two questions in Syria that it has to be raised. Number one question is about the future of the regime, because that 11 million refugees, they have to be relocated in some sense, some of them inside, Syria. And that depends on the regime. And whomever can, solve, that problem, I'm talking about the transition or opening up the regime or something, that is essential. That is, of course, very important. And Russians know it. Americans, of course, know it. Turks, of course, to some extent, know it. Iran accept or not, I think that is not relevant. Number two is the reconstruction of Syria. The number that is estimated now is up to about $1 trillion. Who can pay for that? Neither Russia nor overall, Iran are capable, even in the future, to pay for that. Who should pay for it? The Arab countries and the Western countries. And for this too, all of those have, of course, something to say in the future, especially in reconstruction. Because as long as Syria, of course, remains destroyed and it is not viable as a country, and the government is not a failed state, they have to think about it. Then the situation inside Syria will not stabilize as long as these two questions are not, answered. And the Arab countries very much now, they are pushing Assad. They are, of course, encouraging Assad to join the Gulf Cooperation Council, the decent, that. And I don't have any doubt with the pressure of the Israelis, which want, of course, the Russians and the Turks want inside Syria, and the money of reconstruction. These are the areas that we have to see that they have influence later on in whatever, takes place inside Syria. Not very much the Iranian, because that is a case also inside Iraq too. One day Iran could, of course, chip a prime minister inside Iraq, but that is not the case today. You remember Qasem Soleimani went to Iraq to chip Adel Abdel Mahdi as a premier, and he did not succeed before his assassination by, of course, by Trump. The situation is changing rapidly, and Iranian foreign policy in the Middle East, unfortunately, does not really bring peace and fruit for the Iranian. And one country, of course, another country, Iranian have to really have a different approach. This is overall, my point. I'm sorry.
And also, I have a last question for Dr. Azizi. This is a panel on Syrian crisis, but I think we have to mention the possible Iran-US diplomacy. During the election campaign, Joe Biden promised that he would return to the nuclear deal, but now he changed his rhetoric. He says that in order to return to the nuclear deal, Iran has to be in full compliance, and then there has to be a follow-up agreement. And this follow-up agreement will include Iran's ballistic missile program and also Iran's military presence in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. So according to you, is it open to a negotiation for Iran, Iran's military presence in this axis of resistance?
Okay, sure. Just a quick clarification about some of my points, because it was mentioned by the two other speakers. Actually, what I said about Iran in Syria, it was just my analysis, my understanding of the Iranian view, not that I personally believe that this is the case. For example, with regard to the Astana process, Mr. Barbandi said that it's a framework for coordination. I would go one step further. I would say it's about, just about zones of influence, about kind of, about who are going to get what in the future of Syria between the three countries. And of course, the fact that Iran, you said Iran does not care about the Syrian people. I don't remember that Iran has ever, claimed that protecting the people of Syria has been its main aim for getting involved in the crisis, because it was seen from the beginning as an international thing, you know, this narrative of axis of resistance, the necessity to you know, preserve the axis of resistance, all these things. That was the idea. And unfortunately, this is something that I always say to my Syrian friends, that nobody except for the Syrians really care about Syria, because this is also the case with regard to the others. Russia is there in order to, you know, preserve its access to the Mediterranean. Turkey is there mostly for the Kurdish question. The United States is there for the oil. Donald Trump said clearly now they are there without saying it. So that's my point with regard to that issue. But about the potential wider agreement or more comprehensive agreement between Iran and the United States. Of course, I mean, again, from the Iranian point of view, from the viewpoint of the Iranian government, those issues are not open to negotiations. Why? Because, and this is something that is closely related to that basic question of what Iran is going to, you know, ask in the future in terms of, you know, its presence in Syria. Both of these issues, Iran's regional presence and ballistic missiles, are considered as part of its forward defense strategy. I've discussed this in length in a paper in a research paper for the GCSP. You can, if you are interested, you can, you know, read it. But basically, this is how it's seen. You know, forward defense is part of Iran's view that we need to defend, we need to, you know, shift the borders of our defense beyond our borders in order to be more protected. Missile issue, the missile program serves this purpose. I mean, the same is the case with regard to Iran's regional activity. So that's why these are not open to negotiations. But there is the possibility, as I mentioned, if the tensions generally are reduced between Iran and the United States, I think there's a possibility that the sides can, you know, start talking about some kind of modus vivendi, at least at the regional level. I don't expect any kind of talks on the missile issue, but on the region, especially on some issues. In Yemen, there are already signs that Iran is, you know, willing to talk. And that could be the case with regard to the other countries of the region as well. But it's not going to be as part of what is called a comprehensive agreement. It can come as the next step if the first step, which is the revival of the JCPOA, you know, is going to be successful. So this is my understanding.
I have a lot, I mean, from the audience, Alexis Lekakis Kalkiros, I hope I pronounce in the right way, asked the question, how deep is Iran's presence in Deir ez-Zor? And is it an Iran priority to open a third front against Israel in the Golan Heights? Dr. Azizi, yeah, all of the speakers.
I give that to Bassam.
Thank you, Mr. Mahdi. Thank you. Actually, I will answer something Mr. Mahdi mentioned many times about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Ahrar al-Sham. This is fact that they are terrorist group. They came to Syria. They domain the Syrian pictures or atmosphere as terrorist group. Our problem with them that when they used to have what we call the Free Syrian Army. They were the people who defected from the army, and they tried to defend the demonstration. They didn't find anyone who can support them financially, militarily, the way that we hope that the support to organize them as not as militia, rather than as military, something like this, to put more pressure on Assad rather than to make a military operation like Benghazi on Assad, on Libya. The failing to do this with daily bombing of Assad for the civilian, it radicalized the people. I mean, when everybody remember the barrel bombs of Assad he did in Idlib, non-stop barrel bombs. So what do you think with the people are facing the death every day, nobody controlling or protecting them, and suddenly people with long beard, black shoulders, whatever flags, they come to say, guys, we will protect you. They will join. So we pay the price again of the conflict of the regional powers. These terrorist groups Ahrar al-Sham, Qaeda, and ISIS, they dominate the scene of the Syrian revolution, but they don't represent anything in the Syrian revolution.
Absolutely.
We pay the price of there. So we're back to your questions. Again, the Syrian perception, most of the Syrian perceptions, they don't see Iran is coming to Syria to live. Iran, they want the land in Syria. They are not Russia. They want small part of the seaport to say we are projecting power to the European, to say, guys, we have a base in the Mediterranean. We don't care about you. Iran in Syria, everything they are doing, it shows that they are coming to stay. The border in Deir ez-Zor is very important because it's far away from Damascus. They are under their own control. The other side of the border is the Hashd al-Shabi, the Iraqi Hashd. So when we look about Iranian in Syria, we should not focus about what Iran doing in Syria, rather than we should talk about what Iran is doing in Iraq and in Lebanon. So they are one chain, one machine. And we cannot say, even if we back to the ISIS. So ISIS, when it started in Mosul, when Nur al-Maliki ignored the Sunni, humiliated the Sunnis, and then he opened the doors for 1,500 ISIS guys in Mosul to run away. 1,500. There's no country in the world can open the jail. And this is where ISIS started in Mosul and come back to Syria. And the Iranian and everybody else, they use it as a pretext to go and fight more. It's not about the regime rather than about fighting ISIS. So again, with the borders, I think there's the area on the borders between Deir ez-Zor and Iraq, there's so many Iranian settlements. We add settlers, we can say them settlers and settlement. They are building houses, they are building Husseyniyat, they are getting their own people. They are investing heavily in the people in the way that to make this area is Shi'ism and belong 100% to the Hashd al-Shabi with that process. On the Golan Heights, we back to, I think Dr. Mahdi, he mentioned before that Israeli attacks sometimes the regime military base because the Iranian use the regime military base to hide. The IRGC, he's not talking about Hezbollah, it's the IRGC. Specifically, they go under the regime flags in order to say this is regime forces. And many of most important regime forces as bases are on the Golan because for 60 years or 170 years, Israel is the enemy. So all the military was in the south of Syria toward Israel. And this is where IRGC there, and this is where Israeli everyday bomb. So definitely Israeli and we Syrian, we saw that the Iranians are increasing their activities over there just to put more pressure on Israel. So they have all the South Lebanon, South Syria, they are one front against Israel and missiles front, let's say, or front line. It's fact on the ground now. I mean, that's the question. What the incentive to Iran to leave Syria? Nothing. I don't see nothing. They don't care if Syria reconstructed or doesn't reconstructed because for them, the good Syria they have, the good Syria for their perspective, they have it. They don't care if GCC, they will come and invest money or no. I mean, look, I agree that with Dr. Hadi that most of the country, they believe that GCC have the money to rebuild Syria. But from GCC perspective, they say, guys, we try in Lebanon. We said Rafiq al-Hariri, who has $12 billion, his personal wealth, to build Lebanon. Look, Lebanon, what it looks like. It's failing. Look what Houthi, look in Iraq, what we did. So why to spend money in Syria while Iran is there? And Iran say, I don't need you. If you don't spend the money, that's good. If you don't spend, I'm here. I'm already here. So that's why I think we reached a certain time to some kind of compromise that all these countries, Astana group with small group of Syria under the UN, they will sit to say, guys, let's make it very open talks. What do you want? And whenever I think they reach to what they want, identify what is sphere of influence for each country, I think we will have something like Ta'if Agreement of Lebanon. They get the Syrian to say, guys, the superpower have agreed. This is the deal. You write it the way you like. And all the Syrians are irrelevant, not Assad, not the opposition. No one from Syria is relevant in that equation, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for all of you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for your time.
We are not policymakers, but I hope what we have talked will inspire the policymakers because what we have discussed has been about the recent 10 years. So we hope the next years will be with
Inshallah.
will be peaceful for Syria.
We say American inshallah, not Arabic inshallah.
Okay.
Because there is time limit.
Arabic inshallah, that means nothing will happen.
No. The American inshallah has a little bit of time limit on it. But
Yeah, that's exactly the same. Inshallah, American.
And
Thank you for
following us for the audience.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.